Hello. Welcome to 0 to 1000, the Chess Beginner Kickstarter series. This series is designed to take you from knowing nothing about chess to reaching your first 1000 rating online. Whether you're just learning the rules or you've already played a few games but don't know how to improve, this series will give you the step-by-step roadmap you need. Along the way, I'll cover the basics of strategy, how to avoid blunders, how to use puzzles to train, openings that actually work for beginners, and the mindset you need to steadily climb the ladder. By following each episode, you'll always know the next step to focus on. This is episode 0. Before we jump into strategy and improvement, we need to make sure that everyone has the same foundation, knowing all the rules. If you're already familiar with all of the rules that I'm showing on screen, then you can feel free to skip ahead to episode 1. But if you're brand new, or you want a complete refresher, this is the great place to start. In this episode, we'll cover all the rules that you see on screen here. First, to explain how the board is set up. If you play chess online, you don't have to worry about this because the website will handle it for you. But if you play in person, you need to know how the board is set up. The first important note is that a light square tile should be on the bottom right-hand side. If there are coordinates on your board, you can set the A1 coordinate to be on the bottom left-hand side of the player playing with the white pieces. Now that you have the board oriented the correct way, I'm going to explain how the board is set up. On the 7th row and on the 2nd row, you have an entire line of these little pieces known as pawns. Then, on the corners, you have this castle piece known as the rook. One square in from the rook, you put the knights, which are these horse-looking pieces. One square in from the knights are the bishops. Then, in the center tile, the queen goes on its own respective color. So the white queen will go on the white square, and the dark queen will go on the dark square. And then the king goes on the last square. Now I'm going to explain how all of the pieces move. The king is allowed to go one square in any direction. It is not allowed to capture its own pieces, and it can capture any piece that it can move to. The rook is allowed to move in any direction, horizontally or vertically. It cannot move through or capture its own pieces, and it can capture any piece that it can move to. Next up is the bishop, which is allowed to move in any direction diagonally. Again, it is not allowed to go through or capture pieces of its own color. It cannot go through any enemy pieces, but it can capture any piece that it can move to. The queen is allowed to move in any direction, vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. Again, it cannot go through or capture its own colored pieces. It cannot go through enemy pieces, but it can capture enemy pieces that it can move to. Next up is the knight. The knight moves in an L pattern, where it goes 2 squares in one direction, and then 1 square over. So all of the arrows that I am drawing are all of the potential destinations that this knight can move to. The knight is allowed to jump over its own pieces and enemy pieces. It cannot capture its own pieces, and it can capture any piece that it can move to. And finally, we have pawns. Pawns typically can only move 1 square forward. If the pawn is on its starting square, it's allowed to move 2 squares only for 1 turn. Like so. The pawn is able to capture 1 square diagonally in front of it, like so. and pawns are not allowed to move through or capture pieces in front of it. Now that you know how all the pieces move and capture, we need to know how the game can end. A checkmate is defined by when the king is attacked and has no square it can move to and has no available moves to get out of being attacked. This is known as checkmate. A check, for example, would be a move where the king is attacked but has an option to move out of the check or escape the check. A checkmate is a check where the king has no way to get out of the check, and that is the end of the game. A similar situation is known as stalemate. In this situation, it's black's turn, but black has no legal moves. Because black has no legal moves, but the king is not under check, this is what is known as stalemate. And in this situation, the game ends in a draw. Now we need to know about one of the special rules of chess, which is known as castling. Castling is a special move where if the king hasn't moved, the rook in one of the corners hasn't moved, and there's no pieces in between the king and the rook, they're allowed to perform a special move known as castling. The king moves over 2 squares, where it's usually only allowed to move over 1, and then the rook that was in the corner is going to hop over to the other side of the king. You're only allowed to do this, again, both if the king and the rook have not moved all game. If you are to castle in the opposite direction of the board, that is known as queenside castling, which again, the king moves over 2 squares, and then the rook in the corner is going to hop over to the opposite side of the king. A special note to know about castling: if the king is in check or would pass through check on the way to castling, the king is not allowed to castle. In this case, if I were to castle, the king would end up in check, which means castling is not a legal move in this situation. If you're playing online, the website will not allow you to make this move. If you're playing in person, you have to make sure that at least one of the 2 players knows this rule and would enforce it in the actual game. Another example of this, because the rook is here, the king cannot castle because it would require him to pass through check. So castling in this position is illegal. One more special rule is known as promotion. If the pawn is able to get to the complete opposite end of the board, it's allowed to promote into any piece that you choose. In this case, white is able to promote their pawn into a queen, and black, by getting their pawn all the way to the bottom row, is also allowed to promote their pawn. And finally, there's a special rule known as en passant. I have an entire short here which fully breaks down this rule, so you can check that short out for a full breakdown of en passant. It's pretty rare though. And finally, starting with episode 1 and on, I'm going to be using what is known as notation to explain my moves, which is a way to describe how pieces move from coordinates in order to verbally describe games. I have another short here that you can check out, which I'll also link at the end of this video, so you can watch it and be fully caught up before getting into episode 1. And that's it for this episode. You now know all of the rules of chess. If this was completely brand new for you, take a little bit of time and play a few games against some beginner bots to get comfortable moving the pieces around. In episode 1, we're going to take a big step and learn some basic strategy. Things like why we should control the center, how to develop pieces, and how to evaluate trades and material. This is where you really start building your real chess understanding. In this end title card, again, is the short for where you can learn chess notation, so you can understand how I'm saying moves. Again, thank you for watching episode 0, and I'll see you around for episode 1.